This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. Hello and welcome to episode 141 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Monolith.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Andy.
Good to talk to you all again. I want to talk today about dealing with a crisis at work. Now, normally when I think about this, I think about it from more of a sysadmin point of view of like, you've got to get the website back up, that sort of thing. You've got to get the infrastructure back up online so that people can access the website and keep buying things, that sort of thing. But I wanted to get your perspective as developers on dealing with a crisis. Is it something that you have had to deal with? And what's it like?
It's not something that I've dealt with recently, but it is things that I have dealt with over my career. And at least the positions that I was in, which may be different depending on the type of developer that you are or position you're in. But for the ones that I was in at the time, it was quite stressful because programming is often like a creative, well, it can be a creative time. That's not to say all times are creative. Like there are some times where you're just spitting out the function. But when you are solving a problem, you are simultaneously trying to fix the issue that is happening live. And there might be some like real world ramifications, like the company might be losing money or there might be some sort of active thing going on, right? So there could be real pressure for you to solve it live. But then also you're probably thinking like, how do I get this into the code base through our CI systems into like long-term maintainability? Like a lot of times you don't want to just like put in the really gross fix. So like there's a lot of pressures from all angles, and all of those things make it really hard to be creative and to sit there and think about things calmly and rationally. So for me, that's been a struggle. And on top of that, I also suffer from, if someone's watching me type, I feel like all neurons in my brain cease to fire and my fingers stop working. Like I cannot type or think while someone is staring at me. So like that can also be stressful too, because you might have a boss or a peer or whoever is like waiting for you to get the fix in. So I really feel for developers, but I think a lot of times it doesn't quite fall on development because a lot of like the big outages that you might see in the news are more like systems-y type things, I think. So it really just depends, but I would imagine it's only gotten worse since I've had to deal with it.
I mean, I know that feeling of people watching you type, even at a conference or something, when you're just trying to, I don't know, check out some cool project or whatever that requires a bit of typing in the terminal, and suddenly you just can't type because someone's watching you.
It's typo after typo after typo.
Yeah, exactly. And like, why is tab completion not working? And, I'm just doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
What I started doing for that was I started recording videos of explaining different like programming things or libraries I made to kind of get over it. Now, it was just like me talking to a camera, but I initially had that same kind of like crazy fear, and that really helped. And then from there, I volunteered to give several classes on like Python or Bash, or I forget what it was back in the day, but I gave several classes on that, and that forced me to like get up and give some live demos and talk through stuff. And that really helped. I won't say that I've completely solved this. I still will drop some keys and typos all the time when people are staring at me, but it has helped me to get over that. I'm not nearly as bad as I used to be.
Definitely, me too.
But one thing I was thinking about here was a lot of what you do as developers is sort of asynchronous, offline, and then eventually you push to prod. But hopefully you've tested things to a point where a crisis doesn't happen as often. I suppose that's wishful thinking though sometimes.
Sometimes.
Well, that's the worst, is when they're waiting for a fix to get in and they say, just bypass CI, just push it straight to main or push it to prod or whatever.
No.
And, you know, if your test suite takes 20, 30 minutes to run, there might be a real onus for people to try and push for that, but you never know. You might just introduce more bugs and more offline. So yeah, that's a tough one.
I dealt with a crisis somewhat recently. I'll be a little bit specific because I don't think there's any issue with that. We had overnight a carder attack on one of our payment portals. And a carder is someone who has obtained somehow a whole bunch of credit card details. Might be valid, might not be, might be canceled, they don't know. So they run all those numbers through any payment portal they can find that will tell them some sort of information about the card. That there is money available through the card, that it is canceled, that anything they can find. A payment portal I built We were, I will say this before I describe the payment portal, we were aware of what protections it did and didn't have. We decided it was sufficiently protected for what we thought the threat model was, and then someone found it and attacked it. And then the fix was, we deployed it pretty quickly. But the payment portal had all of the processor mandated protections that I'm aware of. We implemented their anti-fraud system. It collects data from the user's browser and then sends it off to the payment processor. The payment processor verifies against whatever information they have, like your address, your email address, etc. And then the payment processor sends info to my server indicating whether liability has shifted. If it has shifted, we can make the transaction because the processor has said we accept responsibility for any bad stuff that comes as a result of this transaction. So if liability has shifted, process the transaction, everything's good. What happened with this Carter was we simply didn't have enough rate limiting on the website. There was no rate limiting. So they could run as many cards as they wanted through, and even though all the anti-fraud stuff was there, even though none of the cards actually got charged, the payment processor was still angry with us because we allowed this to happen in the first place. So the solution was implement rate limiting. And maybe we implemented it a little heavy-handedly. If 5 transactions fail, no more can happen for the rest of the day. Maybe a little heavy-handed.
Yeah, proper sledgehammer stuff there.
But that site wasn't getting 5 transactions in a day to begin with. There's very little chance of that actually disrupting people unless the Carter comes in again, and then we definitely want to shut down fast, fail fast in that situation.
So in this scenario, Emelith, what was the time difference? Like you get the notification you need to fix something from when you get that notification to when you like decided how to fix it and then actually implement the fix? Was this over the span of like days, hours, minutes?
It was over the span of a day. I woke up, saw the email, and immediately went into our text channel and said, hey, we got this email. Do we know anything about it? We should start investigating. What's going on? And then went to the payment processor's website to start looking through the transactions and see if I can figure out anything similar between them so we can find something to block, find out where they're coming from, anything. And one thing I noticed was that all of the transactions that were seemingly from the Carter were missing metadata about which application created the transaction. The rest of our applications include something custom when we send the transaction to the payment processor for processing. That might be a custom line of anti-fraud for extra protections we've implemented in one application. That might just be this transaction came from this app for another app. It just depends. But these transactions were missing any extra metadata. And after we looked through some of our apps, we realized it was only the one I built that was missing that metadata. So it was easy to find which payment portal the transactions were coming from. I think that took maybe an hour or two to come to that realization. And then by that point, the senior engineer was around and responding. He wasn't actively like developing anything that day. It was his day off, but he was responding and helping because this is something that should be handled quickly. He suggested implementing the rate limiting solution, and then we deployed it within an hour or two after that, I think.
I think this brings out a lot of the things that have been on my mind listening to this conversation, right? So Joe's question about developers are working in this sort of asynchronous way, or the way I think of it is like quite often you're kind of leaning back in your chair, rubbing your chin, right? Trying to think.
Yes.
And this type of situation is not a leaning back in your chair, rubbing your chin. It's like leaning with your nose on the monitor, sweat coming down into your eyes.
But it's important to try to lean back, because if you lean too far forward and rush, you'll end up making way too many mistakes. Don't panic.
If someone was asking for advice, I would say, take a deep breath, right? And you're going to need to do that quite a few times in this day. A few things happen, right? One thing is you actually just need to explicitly switch mode. You realize that a crisis is happening and you're responsible for fixing it. You are not in programming mode anymore. You're in some kind of, it's not like a sysadmin, but it has some of the aspects of that kind of sysadmining thing. But the other thing that really came to mind listening to you, Emelith, is one of the things you have to do when you switch mode is stop feeling bad about how your code is broken. because it happens to everyone. It might not even be your code. It's really not the issue, right? The issue is, what are we going to do right now to fix this problem in the very, very short term so that we have time to take a breath and think about the longer term solution?
Mm-hmm.
When I joined my job a couple of jobs ago, our team were responsible for looking after the live service. There was no one else. And it was in an absolute state. It was falling over every few days. It was costing us in the, I don't know, tens of thousands or even more per hour of time when it was out. And boy, did you rapidly learn. What's interesting about that is I didn't have a lot of knowledge of the system, and so I wasn't much use at the beginning. But I rapidly gained knowledge, not necessarily of the system, but of the kind of 2 or 3 or even 4 ways that it tends to go wrong. And even if there's lots of different causes, it tends to come out in similar patterns. And so actually, after not too long of experiencing that situation, I was like, oh yeah, thing A always goes wrong in this way. And the way to make that go away in the short term is to just delete this thing or whatever. I tell you what, I got good at writing SQL to run on the live database without making mistakes.
That's the most stressful.
Yeah, that's when someone really, really does need to be looking over your shoulder. No matter how painful it is that someone's doing that, you can't press enter on that SQL until a couple of people have had a good look at it.
There was one time I made a snapshot of a database because I intended to do some maintenance on it, maybe even drop it and restore from a backup. And right after creating that snapshot, for some reason, without thinking, I don't know what was going through my fingers because there was no intentional thought that went into this. I deleted the snapshot, and then thinking I had one, I proceeded to drop the database, the production database. That was a fun day.
One of the squeakiest things that happened to me was we had this situation where a load of stuff had collected in a database table. A lot of this stuff in this project was databases underneath it. And so we were doing this delicate job of moving lumps of rows out of that table into some backup table so everything could get back to working, and then we'd gradually move them back in again later. And it was an ancient version of MySQL. The latest version of MySQL at the time was something like 10, and we were stuck on this version that was something like 8.1. And the server that was running it was really creaking, and things were not updated well. And so I was doing moving batches of rows, and as was our normal practice, so I wasn't doing anything too unusual. We gradually increased the batch size as we went so it didn't just take all day to do this thing. So if it works for 1,000 rows, well, next time we'll try it for 2,000, something like that. And I went a little bit far with that. I think I went from 10,000 rows to 100,000 rows. Pressed enter, everything froze. A couple of warning lights on other people's computers turned on, and the MySQL never came back.
Ooh.
It was just gone. So we ended up wiping that machine, installing a new one, installing a new MySQL.
Mm-hmm.
There was some downtime. I think there's an element of excitement to it. I was never expecting that. I never liked performance particularly. Even when I was in a band, I wasn't really in a band, but I was did the computers for a band, and we used to do live performances, and I wasn't that bothered about it. But in this particular job, I did kind of get into the rush of everything's down, we're losing tens of thousands of quid, and if I do the right thing, it's going to be fixed, and if I do the wrong thing, it's not, and that is exciting.
I wonder if more development crises are, I want to say more rare, but that's not really what I mean. Because we all have stories here on things that have happened, and I know tons of other developers do as well. But I'm wondering if for the most part, or at least in, I would say maybe medium-sized businesses and above, once you've deployed something to production, if something goes wrong, ideally there should be a rollback, disable feature, something along those lines that gives the developer an opportunity to say, thing was wrong, you can correct it. And yes, we want you to correct it quicker because of XYZ reason, but it's not sweat dripping down the nose onto the keyboard kind of urgency. So I would like to think that that's the case most often, but I know realistically, that's not going to be every kind of case.
It does depend on the kind of problem though, right? So if the disk's filling or the database is not performing properly or something like that, actually rolling back to a previous version of the code is probably not going to solve the problem.
Well, and in those cases too, though, I would probably call that more of a systems problem, not to be the stereotypical developer, be not my problem, it's those systems guys over there. But a disk filling up or something like
That should have triggered alerts.
Yeah, but the disk's filling up because you wrote your code wrong, right? That's the scenario I'm talking about here.
Okay. All right. I stand corrected, good sir.
But yeah, again, the thing of like the guilt and stuff that you feel about it's my fault, you've got to put that aside. And then somehow you've then got to do some kind of analysis later where you really talk through what is wrong with the design of this code that made this stuff go wrong in this way. And I find that absolutely fascinating. And sometimes you end up by the back door doing some like really important refactoring that was needed that no one ever found time for. But because a crisis happened, you can argue for it and say, we need to do this.
That's sort of like after everything's done, going back and relooking at it, sort of like a retrospective. That's crucial. It depends on the company culture, but like good company cultures that I've been a part of have had like a blameless review that they would look at, and they would very specifically and very deterministically, I think that's the word, look at what happened and not allow you to put any names, departments, or anything on this type of a review. That doesn't mean that like people couldn't be held accountable if they did something wrong, but that would happen outside of any kind of a review. And it really allowed all of the teams to come together and say like, oh yeah, this thing happened and we could have done this better. We can implement this other process. And one thing that I've been trying to do in my own day-to-day life is as we have these sort of like retros or we're looking back at things, one of the things that I've asked some of my team members to do is that like, as we come up with the like what didn't go well or what happened, that we always try and associate that with some kind of an action that we can do in the future. Because I think a lot of times people will see the thing that went wrong and they will say like what they could have done, but that's like, that just gets lost and it's never actually captured into like, this is a new thing that we will do. But then further carry that forward into the next one and say, we said we were going to do this. Did we really do it? And a lot of times the answer might be no, we didn't actually follow our own process, but those are all good learning points. And those are parts that like once all of the crisis is over, the new code is out, everything is running, the company is no longer losing money or whatever's happening, everyone's adrenaline dumps and everyone just wants to go to bed and forget about it and be like, yeah, everything's fine now. It's really, really important to go back and actually look at what really happened, what went wrong, what you can do better, and take that seriously. Like what things can we implement in the future?
The blame-free part of that is absolutely critical. And it's partly because you want to work in a working environment that is not horrific, but it's mainly because you don't identify the actions or the processes that should change if you're just looking for someone to blame, or even if you just accidentally allow someone to take the blame, because it's never one person's fault. No system that allows a single individual mistake to cause a major problem is a system that is healthy in any way. It really should never happen. I've actually been in working environments where I was going over, like doing a kind of retrospective and saying, and then I did this. And then I was told by someone, you just shouldn't have done that. And that was the end of the conversation. It's just like that. It gets you nowhere.
Exactly. Being allowed to blame somebody or something or some process, that's actually kind of an easy out. And that's why I like the companies that will say like, we can't actually determine blame, or we can't actually put people, departments, processes in here. We can just state the facts of kind of what happened and how it went about. And that's actually kind of illuminating, because when you physically cannot list something that you want to point the blame at, you have to actually do some more like kind of root cause analysis and figure out like, why did this really happen and what actually happened here? So I found it to be helpful. And I think more companies would be better off to do that sort of like blameless retro style.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What's the apocryphal story? Some junior sysadmin came in, pressed the wrong button, lost the company £500,000 and expected to be fired. And then the CEO came over to their desk the next day and said, why would I fire you? I've just spent £500,000 on training you.
Yeah. One thing that springs to mind is documentation. People are pretty bad at documenting what they're doing at the best of times, but presumably during a crisis, that just goes out the window. Like even code comments and stuff presumably don't happen as much as they should.
It's usually during the crisis that you find out how out of date your documentation is.
Yeah, I did work somewhere where there was a comment that said, do not leave this in longer than 2 weeks, that I'd found this like from 5 years ago. And that was from an outage. That was done during an outage.
There's, I think, a funny point about documentation, though, is you have to like think about all of the cumulative documentation, and that can be part of a retro. Like we have all this documentation, it's 500 pages worth, and maybe we only needed 5 of it, right? And you can trim that down by several orders of magnitude. So sometimes like more documentation may not be the answer. It might be better, more comprehensive, more concise documentation. It might even be the answer is deleting documentation and going to something, slimmer.
But I do think it's critically important, talking of documenting, that you actually document what's happening during the crisis, right? So if you're going to do that retrospective and it's going to make sense, you're going to need a timeline of what happened when. And normally, in my opinion, the best way to do that in a lot of situations is to use a chat room of some kind.
That's what we were doing.
Yeah, and just dump all your thoughts in there, and then you can go back over it at your leisure.
Yep.
And construct a timeline, and you can see, Andy was going to run this SQL and he pasted it in, and then Amalith said, don't run that, and then, so on.
Find out the channel is actually just 75% GIFs, emojis.
And posting in some sort of channel about what's going on also gives other people who might not be active and officially online at that moment a chance to hop in and help out if they know.
People might bemoan the use of Slack or whatever in workplaces, and I might do that myself. But for emergency situations, if there's one room where everyone knows that's where it's been coordinated, it's an excellent way of doing it.
Well, yeah, it helps the people who are not necessarily the devs or the ops people to know what's going on, and helps them communicate to customers who can't get hold of your website or whatever.
Exactly, yeah.
It can also preempt what's the status? What's the status?
Yeah.
What's the status? And that can also be super, super nerve-wracking as a developer or not even a developer, like a system admin trying to work on something. If you're just constantly getting pinged for status, if you preempt it with every few minutes or so, you're just dumping your thoughts and putting things into a channel, then people can feel informed and they don't necessarily need to ask you for the status. So you might be helping yourself by doing that in multiple ways.
I've also had the role in some those types of situations where there's fairly frequent outages, where I'm the person who communicates outside of the team about what's happening. And that's a skill in itself, right? Because one minute you're deep in what was going wrong? Why is this going wrong? And the next minute you have to kind of really zoom out and say, what's the impact? Which customers are going to be affected? Can we actually do any reasoning to say, actually, these customers are not going to be affected, only these ones are, or whatever it is? Yeah, it's a difficult skill and not particularly one that's taught, I think.
That's one that I don't really think falls into like the developer's purview. I mean, it may in some companies, but step one of crisis is probably stop crisis from happening, right? If you have a way to turn on firewall, turn it on, whatever the thing is, stop the thing from actively leaking. And then also like figure out the extent of the crisis. How much does it affect? What does it affect? All those things. And then after that, you can get into more of the like, how do we fix it? But trying to do all of those things at one person or at one place can be very difficult. So if you have the ability for other people to jump in, maybe it's not like writing code with you, but suggesting things like that, like finding out the scope of it, being the person to relay information between parties, like all that sort of stuff can be extremely helpful.
The communication is so critical because if nothing else, it just totally affects your reputation with people inside the company, outside the company. If you can explain clearly what's going wrong, even if you don't know why it's going wrong, it totally changes the impression it gives other people, and it gives people confidence that you're going to be able to get them out of it.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
And I've been Andy.
See you later.